So tonight we're going to race through several characters and couples and people in Scripture that are candidates for being same-sex couples, or certainly who are different in terms of a simple kind of heterosexual norm model. And so the first one I want to do is it's an easier one. Is Lydia in the book of Acts. Turn to chapter 16. If you have a Bible with you. If not, I'll read it aloud so we can do this. This is Paul is traveling in Asia Minor and is with Silas. And it's really at this point that there's the story of come over to Macedonia and help us, that Paul has a vision that someone from Asia Minor is saying, come over from Macedonia and help us. And so, and they get shipwrecked and they have all kinds of adventures and misadventures as they are traveling. Paul took 3 missionary journey trips. And on this one, in verse 11 of chapter 16, it says, we set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, from there to Philippi, which the book of Philippians is about the church in Philippi. So this is the story of the founding, really, of the church in Philippi. Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home. And she prevailed upon us. And then there's a whole story, and Paul and Silas end up in jail, and it's very dramatic. But at the very end, when they get released from jail, it all turns out well. Verse 40, it says, after leaving the prison, they went to Lydia's home, and when they had seen and encouraged the brothers and sisters there, they departed. And so we see that Lydia's home becomes the center of this house church in Philippi. That's the first Christian church in Philippi. So a few things to notice about Lydia. Philippi was a Roman city. It was a city for discharged Roman soldiers in some ways. So you can kind of think it was like a navy town, or you might think of it in different ways. But it certainly was dominated in some ways by these Roman soldiers who had retired. But notice Paul and Silas, the first place they go to preach or reach people are to a synagogue to try to find fellow Jews, because in some ways, Paul's mission was to the Gentiles, but oftentimes there were Gentile proselytes or converts in places like Asia Minor, people who grew up were Gentiles but converted to Judaism or were sympathetic or interested. So, there could be people who were Jews and actually from Israel, or they could be Jews who became Jews at a certain point. But here it is, they couldn't find the men's group, I guess, but instead they found this women's prayer group. And they call Lydia a God worshiper, which tends to be a phrase that makes you think that Lydia herself was not a Jew by birth, but somehow was becoming or became a Jew, or was a sympathizer or proselyte. Now, Thyatira, where she's from, in the region of Lydia, which is now in Turkey, was a center of dyeing cloth. And there was an art to this making of purple cloth. They took mollusks and they crushed them, and there was a kind of purple substance in the mollusks that they used to dye the purple cloth. And what's interesting to me is that Judy Grahn, who was the poet who wrote the book Another Mother Tongue that I talked about the color purple in its ancient associations. And the color purple was associated with three things: with magic, with royalty, and with LGBT people. So now we, purple, people use lavender or purple, and, we have that. And some of us, even as old as we are when we were young, you heard that purple or lavender somehow was a gay color. And you couldn't wear yellow on Thursday. Remember that? Yes, okay, right. Yeah, right, okay. So, but what is also interesting is that the writer Homer, many years before the biblical writing, maybe somebody knows the exact century when Homer wrote. Does anybody know that off the top of your head? It was before Christ. It was before this. But Homer, who wrote the Iliad, talked about two women who were famous for making purple dye in the region of Lydia. An art that seemed to be passed on to women over generations. But I thought of that interesting thing in Homer, that two women who had a business together of they invented this, somehow discovered the way to make this purple dye. And that Lydia in the Bible seems to have inherited this, perhaps, through families, perhaps whatever, but she is someone who brought that art of purple dye, which was, to have purple cloth was very, very precious. It was very, and so it was for royalty, or used in the magic arts or in other ways. And so here is this interesting woman, Lydia. Now you also notice there is no husband mentioned, and she is, in a sense, what is called the pater familias, which is the head of the household, which was usually male. But it says she and her household were baptized. That means she and her servants, whoever lived in her household. So she was the head of her household. No, she's not said to be a widow. We don't know if she is or not. But here she is, this independent businesswoman, head of her own household, who becomes the first European Christian and the founder, with Paul, of the church in Philippi. So, she could be a candidate for me of someone who I could imagine being a lesbian. I don't always say that if you went from Thyatira and you made a straight line to Philippi, it goes to the Isle of Lesbos. But that's neither here nor there. That's interesting. So that's one of those little stories that is intriguing, because you kind of say, what's that? Who was Lydia, and how did she get to be who she was and where she was? One more time. So I'm handing you an article that I'm not going to go over. It's written by Dr. Mona West. You know who's Elder Mona West, who's Mona is a contributor to the Mercer Bible Commentary, which is a Southern Baptist Bible commentary, before she came out. She has a PhD in Hebrew Bible. And in the Mercer Bible, she wrote the commentary on the book of Ruth, interestingly. She was closeted at the time, but writing. But then she probably wrote what she really thought of the book of Ruth. In this, it's the queer Bible commentary. And I wanted to just read a couple of things that she wrote in hopes that you'll maybe spend a little time and read this. So the book of Ruth is a short novella. In the Bible, it's a tiny, small novel, little more than a short story, a novel. And the main character, disputably, is either Naomi or Ruth. The book is named Ruth, after Ruth. And the importance of the book of Ruth in the time it was written. In the time that the book of Ruth was written was a time when people were not happy with Gentiles. Jews, particularly, sort of were on a campaign of blaming Gentiles for everything that had gone wrong with them, and they had a good case to make in a lot of ways. And so the idea was to kick the Gentiles out. If you had a Gentile wife or family, get rid of them, kick them out. We're going to be purist. It certainly was an anti-immigrant time, okay? So this book is subversive of that. This book was meant to be subversive and to say, you know, good things can come from foreigners. That's really what the book is about. Because, of course, Ruth is the great-great-grandmother of David, the most famous king of Israel. And so, you know, for that reason, you know, she's very important. But she was a Moabitess. She was from Moab. She was not a Jew. And so David, in his own heritage, has a mixed heritage background. He has a great-great-grandmother who was a Moabitess, which in some cases had been the enemy of Israel, or at least kind of not, you know, we're not quite sharing the same exact point of view. So it's important to keep in mind that this book of Ruth kind of had that subversive purpose. And what happens is Naomi and her husband go to Moab. She has 2 sons. They marry. They're in the army. There's a war. Her husband and 2 sons are both killed in the war. So Naomi decides, there's nothing for me here in Moab. I better go back to Israel, and maybe I can scrape up or find some of my family still left, and they'll take pity on me and take me in. So Ruth and Orpha was the other sister-in-law, daughter-in-law, are both grieved that Naomi's leaving. And it's this, in the first chapter, it's this very poignant scene. And we're told, I'm going to just read from Mona's article, it's the second page. We're told that Orpha kisses her mother-in-law goodbye and that Ruth clings to her. It's at this point in the story that Ruth, quote, comes out and declares her true feelings for Naomi. In words that have traditionally been repeated in heterosexual wedding ceremonies, Ruth speaks to Naomi, "Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." These words and actions present the closest physical relationship between 2 women expressed anywhere in the Bible. The Hebrew word that describes Ruth's clinging, davka, to Naomi is the same word used in Genesis 2:24 to describe the relationship of the man to the woman in marriage. He leaves his father and mother and clings to her, and the 2 become one flesh. In her words of devotion, Ruth names her relationship to Naomi using words that depict a relationship that crossed the boundaries of age, nationality, and religion. Ruth chooses against the odds to stay with Naomi, one worthless woman joining herself to another. And in her choosing, she refuses to accept the status quo of society that limits and defines their existence as worthless. She says, Ruth is our queer ancestress. She has gone before us and offers us an example. In her own way, she knew that silence equals death. She says, Orpha kisses her and goes away, but Ruth goes on courageously to name and affirm relationships in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And it is a remarkable thing to think of this passage that is, in some sense, the most romantic and the most devoted statement of any person to any other person in all of the Bible, and it's said from one woman to another. And yet most commentaries that you read will never comment on that or what that might have been. Now, of course, there's no way to know what kind of relationship Ruth and Naomi had, if it was devoted mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. One of the things that's important to know from a lesbian point of view or history is that through most of history, the way lesbians survived and passed was they passed as relatives. Lesbian couples that lived together, now in Boston, they used to have what they called a Boston marriage, which were usually 2 women teachers or professors who lived together. You know, that was a Boston marriage. Most people didn't think of that as a lesbian relationship, but over time, people came to understand maybe what a Boston marriage really was. But oftentimes, women posed as relatives when really they were partners. Now, in one sense, you think Naomi coming back with Ruth and saying this was my daughter-in-law, but who would ever know that if that wasn't the case? I tell the story of coming in one day. Paula was home and there was a plumber in our house, and I came in and he said, "Oh, your sister just told me to blah blah blah." I thought, my sister, And then I realized, Paula. He meant my Paula, okay. And I thought, how easy that would have been, if we lived in a small town and the plumber came over and said, "Your sister," and "Oh yeah, my sister," and he said, these women, they're sisters, and so that's an interesting thing. But it was the cover story. We're cousins, we're sisters-in-law, and so in that sense, Ruth and that story kind of fits with that possibility. Or perhaps, it's very hard. Women's sexuality apart from men was really not much of a topic in the world. That women in patriarchal cultures, women's sexuality was totally derivative of men. So if there wasn't a man involved, my friend Jean White was an MCC minister, and her mother was a very proper English woman, and she was talking to Jean about homosexuality in men, and she said, well, dear, you really can't call what you do sex, can you? Because of course it didn't involve a man, and so I think that was the opinion. In fact, Queen Victoria, they did not have any laws. Sodomy laws did not apply to women because Queen Victoria did not believe that women would ever have sex with each other. So for that reason, there were no laws against it. Mona's article is well worth reading, and then the rest of the story is very interesting too, and I want to point to the end of the story because it's just great. So what happens is that Ruth and Naomi come back. They do find family of Naomi's, and especially in a cousin, Boaz, who is a successful landowner, businessman. He has farms, he has fields, and they allow Ruth and Naomi to come and stay there, and Ruth will glean in the fields, which there was a law in Israel that you left 10% of your fields were not harvested so that poor people could glean, could harvest in them and have something to eat. So Ruth is doing that. That in itself is probably not enough to support her mother-in-law and herself. And so her mother-in-law has an idea and says, at the end of the day, go find Boaz on the threshing floor, it was called. And there's a scene in which Ruth sneaks into where he is, where he's lying down, and in euphemistic terms, seduces him. It says throws her cloak, and he throws his cloak over her after she, gets into bed with him. And so this is the way in which she is asking him to take her and Naomi on as family. And most of the rest of the book of Ruth is about the kind of law and negotiations, because this isn't quite Levirate marriage, because he's not like the brother-in-law of Naomi or anything like that, and it's not Naomi who needs to get married, it's Ruth, who's this Moabitess, a foreigner. She's not even a Jew. She's not really related to Naomi. So Boaz has to go kind of through all these things, but Boaz, a decent, good man, says, sure, and gets people to agree, I will marry her. And of course, she's not his first wife. He has more than one wife, so she would be an extra wife. And really, when you understand and look at the book, it's not like Ruth is moving in with Boaz and then they take care of Naomi. Ruth and Naomi continue to live together, and Boaz presumably lives in his tent or whatever, or with his wife number one, or however that works. And Ruth becomes pregnant, which is the great gift that Boaz is the donor dad for Ruth and Naomi. But what's interesting, if you turn to the end of the book of Ruth in your Bible, let me get there. Okay. Before Samuel. There it is. So that's kind of the And I'll just read the last several verses. So 13 of chapter 4. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin. And may God's name be renowned in Israel." This one, in other words, God shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. So then Naomi took the child, laid him in her bosom, and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse and the father of David. So here, just picture this scene a little bit, And the women are gossiping, and they're saying, that lucky Naomi. She's got Ruth, who is better than 7 sons. So that gives you a little different picture of Ruth than you might think of Ruth. It's interesting that there's this gender thing that they're saying about Ruth. So, my little Bible as a kid, the picture of Ruth was she was just, like she wasn't blonde, but close to it, and a little, very femme and kind of, and you think, I don't know. It seems like Ruth is very capable, and her heart, and what has happened is Boaz had made it possible for Ruth and Naomi to have a child. That Naomi is barely physically related to this child. This is not her son's child. This is her distant cousin Boaz and her Moabitess daughter-in-law, And yet the women legitimize this is family. This is not your ordinary family in Israel. This is not the way things are normally done. And yet the exception is made, the inclusion is made because of Ruth's love and loyalty for Naomi is rewarded in this story. And it is a subversive little story, I think, in more ways than people have ever known. And you notice your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. What a beautiful way of speaking of this relationship between these two women. It kind of defies, especially the usual stereotype, right, of women and their mothers-in-law, that often is so negative. So I think that's a great story, and that story has such resonance in our culture in many ways about marriage and things. So it's I was doing a performance piece about this, and a young heterosexual couple who were about to be married came up to me afterwards and said, because I said, in many ways, this is a women's story. It's a same-sex, it's a lesbian story, and they came up to me and said, "Is it okay if we use that verse for our wedding ceremony?" I said, "Of course, you may use it, yes." But, it's not up to me whether you use a Bible verse or not. But it was so sweet that they somehow thought, oh, wow, it's interesting. So the next one is, of course, the story of David and Jonathan. How many of you ever looked at the story of David and Jonathan at all? Well, this could take us the rest of the time. And there's many other things to talk about, too. But I think Tom Horner wrote a book, Jonathan Loved David, in the mid-1970s. He was a literary person, and most of the information, he is really the person who kind of broke through in this story. One of the most important things he said, first of all, 1st and 2nd Samuel contain some of the oldest literature in the Bible from the time of David. Whoever wrote the books of Samuel was obviously someone who was there. The stories are so rich and detailed, and they read like Shakespeare. The person who wrote this was really the caliber of Shakespeare in terms of their writing about Saul and Jonathan and David and the early story of the kingdom of Israel coming into being in many ways. And these characters are tremendous. And so we think of this 1st and 2nd Samuel. And what Tom Horner said that I really related to was that if these stories had been written in anything but the Bible, no one would ever doubt that the relationship between David and Jonathan was, one, a romantic and probably a sexual relationship. Only because it's in the Bible has there been denial about that. And the denial is amazing. You can read some of the commentaries you read. They had a deep friendship, but it was not sexual. Honest to goodness, there are commentaries that say that, kind of like, there's no elephant in this room, or there's, so as you hear this tonight, think about if these stories were not in the Bible. So, first of all, the context is, this is around the 900s or so BC, and this is in a time, you have to do this, a little time warp problem where Leviticus was actually not written or finalized by this time. So even some of the Levitical laws about holiness or holiness code, or that, some of which have, thou shalt not lie with a man as with a woman, were actually not fully codified by this time. This writing is older than that. And it's written in the style, in the culture of the warrior king culture, the kind of military culture of ancient Israel, which was the king was the head of the army, and there were many wars to solidify the kingdom and to get rid of the enemies, the Philistines and everybody else, David and Goliath, all these stories of military warrior heroes. At the same time in Greece, and others were writing history, the same kinds of stories were being written, and some of them were stories of warrior-lover relationships. This was very common. And in many ways, 1st and 2nd Samuel includes those in it, but it's only our sort of lens around the Bible and our later lenses that we put on that we want to screen that out and say it doesn't exist. So David is actually my nominee for a true bisexual in the Bible, and Jonathan probably a 100% gay man, pretty much. I mean, he is married, has one child, but I think for Jonathan that's more a reluctant situation. For David, he seems to have a full range of sexual possibility, and he gets in trouble for all of it. And he's also, he is the most admired king, who wrote many of the Psalms, who was a musician, and on and on and on. But the kind of, in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, some of the only places where people's beauty is described, for instance, in most of the Bible, there's not a lot of physical description of people or attribution of, oh, that person was beautiful, that person was hot, or anything. There's not very much of that at all. There's kind of a reticence about that, but not in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And warrior kings and people like that, for the most part, had the freedom to do anything they wanted to sexually, and were not punished for it, except in the story of David. You may remember that David, who was married and had other wives, admires Bathsheba, sees her bathing on the roof. He's older at this point. He is a little bored. And, Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who's a loyal soldier. And David, in any way, has him put to the front of the line and, in a sense, orders his killing so that he can get away with having his affair with Bathsheba without Uriah finding out or anyone finding out, especially because she was pregnant, and so he didn't want her to. So he has this man who was loyal to him, loved him, killed. And Nathan the prophet, it's the first instance of prophecy in the Bible, is Nathan the prophet who comes to him and says, have a story to tell you, David. Said, there was a man who had one sheep, and there was a man who had a whole bunch of sheep. It's not a great analogy for marriage, but there you go. It's in the Bible, And the man with all the sheep liked the sheep that this man had, the one and only sheep he had, and stole it. And David gets furious, and, where is this guy? Let's get him, kill him, he's terrible. And Nathan looks at him and says, thou art the man. So David thought he had gotten away with something, and the prophet Nathan nails him. Now, the powerful thing about this story is that in Israel, because David believed in God and that there was a judge greater than him, unlike other kings in the Near East who thought they were God, David actually didn't believe he was God. And so when Nathan nailed him on this, what happened was he fell apart. He and went through a terrible time. Bathsheba lost the baby. David saw that in his view as a judgment of God, which was his theology. Wouldn't be mine, but it was his theology. But it was a humbling experience for David, that he was called on an injustice that he did, on a murder that he sanctioned, to cover up his affair with Bathsheba. So this is David's complexity in all this. And in the midst of all this, there is the relationship really of Saul and David and Jonathan. So if you look to, let's get there. 1 Samuel 16, if you have your Bible. So, there are all these stories. Saul is coming into power. He's the first king of Israel. So there's this interesting passage where okay, here we are. They're looking for God's anointed, really a successor to Saul. And Samuel, the prophet, is searching for this. Now, Saul is, in one sense wants to be gracious about this, but is very nervous. Why are you looking for my successor in some ways? And some things that Saul has done have angered the prophet. And so Jesse, this who has all these sons, calls his sons forward, and Samuel is kind of looking over the crowd, who's going to be the one. And it says, verse 10 of 16, Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. And then Samuel says to Jesse, are all of your sons here? And he said, well, there remains yet the youngest, but he's keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send him, bring him here, for he will not sit down until he comes here. He sent and brought him in. Now David was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, rise and anoint him, for this is the one. And it says, then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Now it said, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit of the Lord tormented him. And so this is beginning to be the drama of the Shakespearean drama, a little like Macbeth or something. Here's Saul is starting to have migraine headaches and lots of other problems. And so he kept saying, provide for me someone who can play for me the harp. Someone plays for harp, and I'll feel better. And one of the young men said, I've seen the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech, a man of good presence. And so then Saul says, send me your son David, who was with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread and wine and sent David to Saul. And David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. And whenever the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it, and Saul would be relieved. So there's this relationship then between Saul and this David, who has been anointed secretly by Samuel to be his successor, but Saul doesn't know that that's that same David. You can kind of see this plot really thickens and gets kind of crazy. So kind of moving forward, you have David and Goliath, and there's even a little thing where there's another chapter where it kind of sounds like Saul met David when he slew Goliath, not this other David who was in his household playing the harp and doing all that, which just tells you there are different sources for some of these stories. But if you go to chapter 18, or just right before 18 starts, it says, on David's return from the killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And he said, I'm the son of your servant Jesse. But when David, starting the 18th chapter, first verse, had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David. Jonathan is Saul's son. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Okay, we're getting that message, right? This is intense, isn't it? Then Jonathan stripped himself of the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, and as a result, Saul set him over the army. So in this very remarkable passage, Saul's son, Jonathan, who would be the one succeeding Saul, in this thing of his stripping his sword and belt, he gives David all of the symbols of his role. Instead of Jonathan being the prince, now David is the prince and the heir to Saul. This is what Jonathan is saying. And, Saul brought David into his house. Did he do that because Jonathan loved him and because, there was this connection? And romantic connections between men were not uncommon, but the deal was you had to marry and have children, and, but you can kind of see, it sounds a little one-sided. You don't get a sense of what David felt in this moment so much, but you really hear from Jonathan. Now Saul was going to be losing power, and now his son, and David is the usurper who was also, though, anointed by Samuel secretly. The plot thickens. Okay. So in the next couple of chapters, Saul decides he's just going to kill David. That's what's going to happen. Basically, chapter 20, David comes home and finds Jonathan and say, what have I done? Why is your father trying to kill me? It's this terrible stuff going on. What is my guilt? And Jonathan says, don't worry. This is chapter 20, the first few verses. You shall not die. My father does not do either great or small things without disclosing to me. And why should my father hide this from me? Never. But David says, no, your father knows well that you like me. And he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this or he will be grieved. See, so Saul is plotting to kill David, but not telling Jonathan, even though and so they're having this back and forth argument. Let's see. So they go back and forth, and in verse 12 it says, Jonathan says to David, by the Lord, the God of Israel, when I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you? But if I don't, then you're to go away. And so Jonathan makes a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord seek out the enemies of David. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as his own life. I mean, how many times can you say over and over again, he loved him as his own soul, he loved him as his own, he's given away his kingdom to David, who, is the charismatic, shining star and leader. And so then you go to verse 30, because then Saul begins finding out that Jonathan is, he's going behind his back and talking to David, and he suspects this. And think of this does not sound like, a father and a son's argument, and where the father's upset because his son is gay. Just listen to this, verse 30. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan. He said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame, and so to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Now send him to me here, for he shall surely die." And Jonathan answers his father, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Can you see this drama, playing out? We don't ever read this in church. You notice that it's never in the lectionary. But Saul threw his spear at him, to strike him. So Jonathan knew that it was the decision of his father to put David to death. Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger. He ate no food on the second day of the month. He pouted. He went to his room. He's like, "I'm not going to eat. I'm so mad." For he was grieved for David, and his father had disgraced him. And then this is the last piece I'll read in this book. But in the morning, Jonathan went out into the field to the appointment with David, and with him was a little boy. He said to the boy, "Run and find the arrows that I shoot." As the boy ran, he shot arrows beyond him. When the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called after the boy and said, "Is the arrow not beyond you?" And Jonathan called after the boy, "Hurry, be quick, do not linger." So Jonathan's boy gathered up the arrows and came to his master. But the boy knew nothing. Only Jonathan and David knew the arrangement. They have a secret meeting and a secret code and all this. So Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and said, "Go carry them to the city." And as soon as the boy had gone, David rose from beside the stone heap and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He bowed 3 times, and they kissed each other and wept with each other. And David wept all the more. And the translation of that says, "Meaning of the Hebrew uncertain." Now, in the King James Bible, it says, "And David exceeded himself." Okay? There is no dictionary that quite tells us in King James English what that means. But Tom Horner says it is an expression of passion. It could mean an erection, ejaculation, or it could mean whatever, but it does not mean David wept all the more. That is a euphemistic translation even in the New RSV Bible. And nowhere, even in the New RSV, does it ever say anything. So if none of this was in the Bible, would you have any doubt what Jonathan's feelings in relationship with David were? Would there be any doubt, really? No. Because it's in the Bible, of course, that gets edited out. But it's interesting but it survives in the Bible. Nobody took that out, which is so interesting, isn't it? In a way, that it survives this tremendous passion and loyalty and love. And even if it was love that was never consummated sexually, which in David's time would be unlikely, men, in a sense, did what they wanted to do. There was not many compunctions around that. So the one last thing in David and Jonathan is 2 Samuel, because what happens is, of course, Saul and Jonathan die in battle together. And so David wrote a lamentation for them. It's one of the most famous in the Bible. In 2 Samuel, 1st chapter, verse 17. David intoned this lamentation over Saul and his son Jonathan. And he said, "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your high places, how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exult." And it talks more about their death, what happened there. Verse 23. And remember that David also loved Saul. You know, he served Saul in his household. In some ways, Saul's relationship with David looks a little bit like, you know, the wealthy kings and masters who had servants or slaves who they also had as lovers. So, you know, it's a very complicated thing. But he says, this is the most beautiful, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you with crimson and luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. And then Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. And it switched then to the personal. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. So here's David, who I think is, like I said, bisexual in many ways, who had love affairs with women, and yet at the end of his life, Jonathan, of all his loves, was the greatest love. And by saying surpasses the love of women, what you realize, because he didn't have to say it that way, but in saying it that way, he puts them on the same par level in a way. You know, the kind of love I felt for women, I felt for Jonathan, but it even surpassed for me. Yeah. What's that? What? He lived to be a very old man, king, and he died peacefully in his sleep, not in battle. No, Saul and Jonathan were in battle together against the Philistines. So they were, going out and, fighting together, and they died together in the same battle. And Jonathan was in command of all the armies by that time. But Saul and Jonathan were fighting together and were killed. So I think, it has all the elements of jealousy and rage and a father and son, and, it's quite amazing. And everything in the drama is something, that could be written very contemporarily. The father who's angry because his son loves Jonathan more than he loves his own future, or, as the king, maybe more than you love me, you love David, and and then he even tries to kill his son. He's so angry, what a disappointment Jonathan is, And what's interesting is they made this covenant about their households, and Jonathan actually did have a son, Mephibosheth, who was lame and who's disabled, and David took him into his own household and took care of him the rest of his life. So, they were, clearly family to each other. Any thoughts or questions or something surprising to you? Did all of you kind of know this? Was this like, oh my gosh, I never really realized there was that much in there? 'Cause yeah. So, we say, Jonathan loved David, or, there was Jonathan and David, and many, Sunday school classes, they were really they were biffs, they were best friends. But, when you actually read the text, it says a lot more than that.
I had seminary, and the books I took, and your book, to study and take time for First and Second Samuel. I hadn't
Wow.
heard of anything
Wow.
close to this.
Right.
I had a study Bible with all in fact, I still use the study Bible.
Right.
And none of this is,
But I tell you,
annotated or anything.
but First and Second Samuel is as racy in King James as it is in, contemporary modern. I mean, it's all there in the King James. There's no.
Focus on it.
Well, right. Well, it's the lens that you're looking at, and when you begin to realize. So I think what's important, you have both David and Ruth who are related, and both of whom are certainly non-conforming to at least a modern understanding of, what is relationship, marriage, family, or all that. And it makes rich how rich the Bible is in so many, with key important people. David was beloved, he's the most beloved king of Israel. And yet in this story of 1st and 2nd Samuel, he is certainly bisexual, and not apologetic about that. No prophet ever says to David, "Oh, you loved Jonathan, that was terrible," or that never happens. It's the way he had his Uriah the Hittite killed to cover up his indiscretion with Bathsheba that becomes the sin, not this. And so I think it's very powerful to that lamentation, particularly in 2 Samuel. It's one of the most important lamentations probably in all of literature. And it's to Saul and Jonathan. And then that wonderful personal note at the end, "I'm distressed for you," and I love you, and your love even surpassed the love of women, which is saying something for David. David really loved women, So there are some other ones you can look up yourself. The centurion's slave. Very interesting commentaries about that. When Jesus heals the slave of a centurion, for whom obviously this was an important relationship to this centurion, and the very words in Greek in Matthew are words that are used to describe, it means my intimate boy. That's actually what the words in Greek mean, and it's translated his slave or whatever, but actually the words are very specific, and Jesus healed this slave of this centurion, who was a Gentile, a foreigner, and obviously, in a relationship with someone of the same sex. And so there are others. I think, we could talk about Paul. That would be fun sometime. He's interesting in terms of his relationships with men, which were often stormy and troubled and emotional, and so yes.
What I don't understand is that from later laws,
Mm-hmm.
things that he involved these boys or stuff have changed.
Yes.
That's why
Cultural attitudes and changing culture and attitudes. Yes. And John Boswell, not the one from the 17th century, but the one from recently, wrote a book about that, about how did those passages come to get interpreted. Like the Sodom and Gomorrah story, it's a very similar thing, that the increase in prejudice against same-sex sexuality, or eventually any kind of other sexuality, and there are different theories about that, about when there's in rural cultures versus more urban cultures, where it seems like more sexual diversity would thrive. In rural cultures, you need people to heterosexually reproduce, especially to have more people working the farms and all that. So there are many, many different theories. But clearly, in the Bible, there are layers of this. And so I think it's important. It's sort of like all kinds of things about what kind of families happen, in the Bible. It's very hard to find in the Bible a family with a mother and a father and a couple of kids with no other complications. I ask you to think about that. Think about that. You could say Adam and Eve, and they had two sons, of course, three sons. Of course, the one son killed the other son. But where are there the kind of more narrow definition of family that's very modern, that's not polygamous, or that's not, virgin birth or other kind? Where are those families? There's a lot of questions in the New Testament. Who is married and not married in the New Testament? There was a lot of there's some debate about that, and so it is interesting to try to understand what people's relationships were, and that's also, how women were treated, the dynamics between women and men. What's important is to sort of let the text free and be heard. But you notice we don't read those passages in the lectionary. And that's because there are people who, hundreds of years ago began choosing the lectionary passages that were read. Some were read and some were not. Well, you can kind of see why some of these might not have been read, It would bring up questions, and even as people have studied the Bible, oftentimes that's suppressed. So, yeah.
I was just going to say that my husband, my husband that had died, was brought up in the Lebanese community, and some of them to this day married their relatives, even first cousins and stuff through.
Like a Levirate.
Through the line, through the right, and that was started,
Right.
back before time began. No,
Right.
And really
Right.
took over, and some of them still do that.
Right. Yeah, it's a way of providing another line for that person, that family. Well, let's rise as we're able. And it was a lot of fun. Oh. Well, God, tonight we remember Ruth and Naomi and how nonconformist they were. In whatever ways they lived out their love for each other and for the baby that came into their lives that became the grandfather of David. And God, we remember Saul and Jonathan and David, and how, as they lived their lives and sought to build a kingdom, they also, God, had to deal with you and allow you to be God for them. We thank you for the prophets and the people who spoke, and we thank you for the testimony to love that we heard tonight, that comes through clear to us, and we receive it. We thank you for great loves in the Bible and in our own lives. Bless us as we go from this place in Jesus' name. Amen.